Good evening. We're so thrilled that everybody's joining us around the world for this 8th session of the International Conference on Sustainable Development. My name is Lauren Barredo, and in addition to being your moderator for the next hour, I am Head of Partnerships at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. It is one of my greatest honors and thrills to introduce our keynote speaker, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Her Excellency Mia Mottley. Madam Prime Minister, we will get you connected. It looks like you've already done that. Prime Minister Mottley is the 8th Prime Minister of Barbados and the first female to hold the position. Previously, she served as a parliamentarian, a Minister of Education, Attorney General, and Deputy Prime Minister. So her wealth of expertise in government is deep, and we really look forward to hearing from you. Madam Prime Minister, I yield you the floor, and I'm going to turn my camera off so that you're full screen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really am very happy to be here this morning with you. When I was first invited, I expected to be in New York, but such is life and such is 2020. I really want to thank you for the honor of being able to address this 8th Annual Sustainable Development Summit, because I do believe that this gives us an opportunity from this part of the world to be heard, and to have a voice. And really and truly, 2020 has brought together a perfect confluence of events for us. One, the continuing climate crisis, because that is the one thing that COVID-19 has not canceled. Two, the pandemic itself, which has literally brought significant difficulties to our region. And while we've managed to contain the spread relatively well in our country, with only just under 200 cases, most of them imported, and 7 deaths, regrettably, it has still caused a psychological scar that will forever remain on the minds of our people. And thirdly, the triggering economic implosion that has come as a result of the pandemic, while at the same time requiring us to become resilient against those elements of the climate crisis. And I want to start there because everyone will speak now about the hurricane season, because we are already into the Greek alphabet. At one point last week, we had 5 systems within our region or coming at our region, and that uncertainty is normally only recorded by those who are ardent fans of the region. But most people don't take into account that it is not only the hit of a hurricane that does damage, but the threat of a hurricane that loses productivity, because people must prepare in the event that it comes. But separate from that, the climate crisis consequences are greater for us, because the hurricanes really are the heart attack of the climate crisis, and the droughts and the floods, and in particular the sargassum weed, those are the other chronic NCDs that we have to put up with almost on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and for which we have little or no help. I start here because we belong to a world that has, in meetings, found ways of agreeing to glorious things and found ways of trying to adapt definitions and criteria, but very often they're not suitable to those of us who are small island states, those of us who are middle-income countries, and those of us whose voices are only heard at set piece times such as this, when the United Nations is meeting, or on occasion for an academic lecture. And we have to ask ourselves whether this is the kind of world that can yield the results that we want in order to leave a better world for our children. I come back to the issue of the climate crisis, because the world seems adamant that it is okay for some of us to be dispensable. When you agree to a 2-degree change, that is effectively what you're sentencing us to. And I can look outside now, and on many a day up last week, we saw the sargassum rolling into the coast, and that has a negative impact on the capacity of enterprises to conduct their business daily. But it isn't only the climate crisis and the failure to recognize that we were not the ones leading to the increased carbon footprint, and we were not the ones who are triggering what now may well be one of the biggest glacier melts in the history of mankind. But we are on the front line of the consequences. And while that is said year after year after year, it has not propelled anybody into action, particularly on initiatives such as the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage. And we do believe that if we are going to be able to build out a more resilient future, then we have to take into account that the consequences of the climate crisis, now compounded by the consequences of the pandemic, make it difficult for us from a macroeconomic perspective to be able to access the funding necessary at the rates, or whether grant funding or low interest rates, concessional rates, that are necessary to help us build out our country and to help us build out our housing to be more resilient. In Barbados, we have already lost or had damaged as much as near 55–60% of our coral reefs. That cost has meant that over the years, we've had to invest heavily in borrowing in order to be able to stabilize any further damage to our coastal economy. And much of our economy is in fact coastal, so that it is imperative that we invest in those resources to help protect the remaining aspects of our reefs, and to see if we can, using new technology, build back reefs so that we leave a better legacy for our children than the one which we have received as a result of the impact of the climate crisis, and also agricultural runoff and other things, practices that we are now changing our people to be able to benefit from. But the impact is a beleaguered debt profile. And when we now consider, as I want you to, the impact of COVID, with absolutely zero revenue for the first few months coming in as a result of the lockdown measures that we had to take to contain the spread of the pandemic, then you begin to see how a country like Barbados, that in December came out of a debt restructuring, both local debt restructuring in 2018, foreign debt restructuring in 2019, but now finding ourselves back in 2020 with an inevitable uptick in the debt, in spite of the fact of all of our best efforts to be able to keep it down. We entered an IMF program 2 years ago when we became the government, recognizing that our debt then was unsustainable. And therefore, the threat of debt going back up again is one that we believe at the international level has to be the subject of some kind of global discussions and global compact. The world gets it in terms of some kind of debt relief suspension or debt suspension for low-income countries and either countries. But it is the middle-income countries who have fought hard to be able to lift themselves out of poverty, but who now are the most vulnerable, not because of their own actions, as I pointed out, with respect to the climate crisis, with respect to the pandemic, and often with respect to international economic shocks, whether caused by terms of trade or other functions. So that, my friends, I am asking that we consider, Barbados has been, over the course of the last few months, leading a campaign within our region to get persons to recognize that if we can isolate the COVID-related debt, then we ought to treat it in the same way that the rest of the world treated World War II debt, for example, with the British bonds that were issued, which were extremely long tenor, low interest rate. And in our case, we're asking, in addition to that, that we have the elbow room from 5 to 7 years in order to be able to return to the development path and return to a growth path. Because if after COVID, all we can do is literally eke out an existence by paying debt, then we will have sentenced ourselves back to decades of underdevelopment, purely because we have not been innovative enough at the global level in order to develop instruments that can give countries that elbow room such that they can be independent again with respect to their financial management and economic management. Similarly, we have to be able to relax our concept of what is an appropriate fiscal anchor and whether the debt to GDP ratios that we are asking countries to hold to may not need to be relaxed over the course of the next few years, because generally, most countries and most developing states will in fact see an increase in debt somewhere between 15 and 30% of GDP, largely because most small states do not have any other option, because once you have tourism and travel dependent countries whose dependence is in excess of 35–40% of GDP, the revenue is not coming in, the level of unemployment has skyrocketed, and quite frankly, we have the only ability is to sustain the implosion of the private economy is for the state to step in and save lives and then save livelihoods. So my friends, I've come to this moment this morning to share with you for these 10, 12 minutes some of the concerns that face us in terms of the concept of sustainable development. We want to be able to execute a roofs to reefs program that, one, secures the roofs of our population. My greatest fear in Barbados is that if we are hit, and we have not been hit for a number of decades, but if we are hit frontally by a hurricane, then I expect that we will lose a significant amount of our housing stock, largely because the roofs that were built since the last hurricane were not necessarily built in the 1950s and 60s with the hurricane straps and with the eye to engineering that would have made a difference. And the scale of transformation for those houses is in the tens of thousands, way beyond the capacity of the state to be able to finance or to be able to put the resources in place without significant concessional resources to be able to on-lend to house owners. Similarly, I've spoken to you just now about the reefs. But in addition to that, we have to come with the realization that we need to be able to protect our waters from the sewage and to be able to do the kinds of investments that would see us treat the sewage at least to near drinking water level or to absolute drinking water level, to replenish the aquifers and to use ultimately as a means of boosting and offsetting the drought that has beset us. My friends, this is a moment for the world to determine whether global leadership is capable and whether we can rise to the occasion to summon the political will for that global leadership. Regrettably, what we see is a world that is seeking hard to unravel the gains of multilateralism, unravel the gains of 70 years of a United Nations, however imperfect, and we can come back to the issue of how we reform the governance structure. Mr. Sachs has done an excellent job in working with the United Nations in being able to settle on the MDGs and the SDGs. But at the end of the day, without access to funding, without access to creating the fiscal space and the policy space for a development path, we will not get there. And one of the key aspects, and to show you the extent to which our voices have remained in the wilderness for too long, 30 years ago, the Caribbean was at the forefront with the Commonwealth in order to be able to create a vulnerability index. Because at the end of the day, it matters not what our per capita income is, it matters how vulnerable we are. And in terms of that, what are our vulnerabilities to climate, to pandemics, to international economic shocks? But at the end of the day, can we absorb them, and can we absorb them in a continuous or cumulative fashion or parallel fashion? And these are the issues that will engage us as we go forward. I want to salute your advocacy over the years for sustainable development, but I do want you to recognize that small island states and middle-income countries in particular have a particular set of circumstances that are literally triggering us into a rapid descent of development if we're not careful. And those issues, as I said, come from that failure to treat to debt, but it also comes from the arbitrary use of or reliance on definitions and criteria that act as inappropriate proxies to determine what our circumstances are. I give you two examples. Historic per capita income is used to be able to determine access for benefits from many of the international financial institutions. And in truth and in fact, that is as useful as me saying, can I take my blood pressure from 2 years ago and determine as to whether I will get a heart attack today? It is an inappropriate and crude proxy that is no longer appropriate to our needs. Similarly, with respect to access to the in vitro diagnostics for the pandemic, we're being told that maternal mortality is being used as a proxy to determine which country should benefit from it. Now, once again, that has nothing at all to do with the reality that it is our tourism workers who, in fact, have lost all of their employment and revenue and company income. And to that extent, our capacity to be able to access vaccines is constrained by what elbow room we have. And we find ourselves having to recapitalize our social security systems, refinance and support our productive sectors, but particularly our tourism and hospitality sectors, and dependent on them are artists, dependent on them are water sports operators, dependent on them are taxi operators, and dependent on them are restaurants and tours and attractions. So when you begin to understand the extent to which this has affected us, then you recognize that for the world to remain silent as small island states face this issue and other issues, not of our own making, then we begin to ask ourselves whether the world in which we live does not more resemble the world in which those of our grandparents or great-grandparents who fought for independence from colonized states were then living in. I regret that that is the kind of comparison that we're forced to make, but the absence of equity and the absence of fiscal space and the absence of policy space for small states has regrettably relegated us to this perspective that unfortunately I share with you this morning. I would much rather share a far chirpier and better reality, but this has been our reality, not just in 2020, but cumulatively as a result of the failure for the Caribbean and small island states to be seen, to be heard, and to be considered important enough to matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Prime Minister. And I'm told that we have a couple minutes for just a couple questions. You touched on so many interconnected issues, which I think is just wonderful, sort of setting up this very holistic way that the challenges that we're facing today are interrelated. I want to maybe first think about the points you raised on financing and the impact of the pandemic on the economy, particularly all the tourism sectors you mentioned. I'm wondering, I think there's a little bit of tension here. On the one hand, there's been a lot of a turn to more nationalism. On the other hand, I think there's been a call for a stronger multilateral response. And I know that groups like the World Bank and the IMF have tried to pass some new mechanisms and new support features. I'm curious to hear your take on how optimistic you are if this is something that could potentially bring us together and change the system to be a little bit inclusive in some of the ways that you discussed, if you're seeing it's more continuing business as usual. And I'll tie that in as well to a question we have from Angela Viano on, has Barbados specifically received any support from the UN, the World Bank, or the IMF?
Okay, let me contextualize that for you. The management of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva and her team, have been exceptionally understanding in trying to see how best they can work with countries, not just countries like ourselves that were in a program, but other countries who had to come to them. Over 70 countries have already received assistance. The issue is where they really need to go, and they can't get there, even though the management accepts that both at the IMF and the World Bank. The bottom line is that countries have to provide the political will to go outside of the norm. And where we need to go in order to appropriately respond to COVID with the climate crisis still on our doorsteps is to go outside of the norm. We may need to look at an increased allocation or a reallocation of SDRs. We may need to look, as I said, in particular, of being able to take the COVID-19 debt from the beginning of COVID. And this is not just for the health-related expenditure, but for the economic support measures that are necessary and the Social Security recapitalization that is necessary in order to get through this COVID period. And if we can refinance that over a 50, 60, 70-year period at virtually zero interest rates or 1-2% interest rates, while giving us a 5-7-year moratorium so that there's a clear path where we can resume growth. But at the same time, you have to relax the fiscal anchor. Now, I think that they're beginning to get it. We're beginning to hear from the United Nations, from the IMF staff, understanding of the concept of vulnerability. But without the political will of the developed nations of the world literally saying it is okay for us to turn the corner on this, it doesn't happen. And I give you the example of the World Bank. Mercifully, at the beginning of July, the United States government, through Secretaries Mnuchin and Pompeo, and I want to thank them, but before that, for the last 2 years, Barbados tried to access exceptional access to funds at the World Bank, as Latvia had done, as South Korea had done in the past, when you were in the middle of an IMF program and trying to be able to see what kind of concessional funding can trigger development. It only has now begun to start to happen, largely because the will of the countries on the board who can make that difference has to be given. If not, we're not going anywhere. And that is the fundamental problem. So the management seem to be getting it. We have now to continue the political advocacy so that the countries who can make that definable difference with their voices and with their voting power can do so for small island states. There are about over 1/5 of the nations of the world are small island states, and a number of us are middle-income countries, but are totally at risk of pauperization as a result of the confluence of these events.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for maybe just one more question, and I would put to you, I know we have a number of people who have signed on from small island countries, but I know we have another large proportion of our audience who is not. What can we do if we're not where you are to support you? You know, what are the actions that we can take to help countries like Barbados fight climate change and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think we need to have a global chorus of voices pressing action on their political structures and entities in their respective countries. We've seen what the world's response can do with climate already. And while it is literally raised its the level of awareness globally, it needs to continue on a sustained basis. I suspect that the presence of the pandemic has given it a heavy lash in terms of being top of the mind for most people and most countries, but we cannot let the issue drop. At the same time, I think that if we can continue to put that pressure, we've seen what happened with Black Lives Matter, and that literally the rising up of persons across the world validated the whole concept and notion of reparations, not as anything other than a recognition that if you extracted wealth from countries decade after decade, century after century, then at the point at which those countries have responsibility for themselves, they don't have either the development of the infrastructure or the capacity through cash to do what they need to do. And they were never left with a settlement. Whereas those who were responsible for slavery and those who were responsible for colonialism were the beneficiaries of the extraction of wealth. Black Lives Matter has literally said to the world, it is okay for us to start to have this very difficult discussion that literally people were not prepared to have before. And why is it okay? Because the people of the world have risen up and said, we believe that it is unjust to treat people in this way, and we need to start to deal with racism and anti-racism and unconscious bias. So I think that what can you do? Lift up your voices, use your fingers and hands to be able to write the letters and to do and reach out to your political representatives, because at the end of the day, once they begin to recognize that if we don't get these countries sorted out, what we're going to have is economic implosion. What we're going to have is uncertainty and unsafety in our neighborhood. What we're going to have is migration. What we're going to have is an increase in crime, an increase in poverty. And then fundamentally, what we have to do is to do the right thing, because it is a right and moral thing to do, which is to save our planet and to save the lives of our children and our children's children and their children.
Thank you so much. I can't think of a better to end than with that strong call for action that all of us can take. I don't know, maybe I'll ask one quick follow-up. You brought up the Black Lives Matter movement. Just very briefly too, I'm wondering any parallels you see between that and the longer term climate change fight. You know, Barbados is at the forefront of this global call for greater equity and inclusion and fairness, and links between the current way people are talking about reparations and the earlier climate common but differentiated responsibilities, and general, just with all the points you raised on financing, the need to morally and ethically, you know, pay for the damages that we've caused.
Well, regrettably, both the Black Lives Matter movement and the climate crisis movement both speak to inequity and discrimination and unfairness, because both of them speak to power being used in order to secure profit and to secure advantage and to secure power on an ongoing basis, rather than recognizing that there is an underlying class of persons who are being discriminated against. In the case of Black Lives Matter, it is straight. We know the institutional racism. We know also the lack of opportunities for Black communities, the lack of support with respect to social services and access to economic opportunities, and not just in the United States of America, where the Black Lives Matter started, but also across the world. And the parallels as Black countries and our capacity for greater equity in governance structures and greater transparency globally, all of these are things that are relevant considerations as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Charter that was established with countries that were colonizers and that did not have the wide raft of countries that it now has in the post-independence movement. Similarly, with the climate crisis, we have persons who are continuing to make money and to continue to expand their empires on the basis of what they want to do, irrespective of the consequences to climate, irrespective of the carbon footprint, and irrespective of the fact that they are literally causing and triggering additional expenditure and in some instances implosion of aspects of our economy as a result of their actions, but they're not prepared to step up and help us to pay for it. And that is the fundamental inequity and discriminatory actions as a result of their selfishness.
Well, Madam Prime Minister, thank you again so much for your insightful comments, your call to action. It's been one of the highlights of this event for us to be able to include you, and we're so grateful for your time, especially given I'm sure that you're very busy with many other events for this high-level week of the UN General Assembly. We wish you all of the best with all of your other media appearances.
And I'd like to invite you to, at some point, come to Barbados and do some of your classes, come to Barbados and be able to show the perspective from here so that you can give your students and those who follow you another perspective in real time, while at the same time smiling because you're enjoying both the sun and the sea.
Well, I am sure many of our faculty members and students who are online will definitely take you up on that. Thank you so much again, Prime Minister.
Certainly. Thank you so much.
So we're now going to turn to the second half of our hour to a panel discussion. It's going to be on the transition to renewable energy. So prior to the global pandemic, there were a lot of increasing investments in renewable energy, and the dollar value of this sector was growing really rapidly. Initially during the pandemic with the economic recession, a lot of people sort of projected that investment would decline. But given the attention that we've seen on building back better and the development of green economy recovery packages, it doesn't necessarily seem that that might be the case. It seems like we might be at a inflection point upon which we might be able to support and further the green energy transition. So that's what we're going to talk about for the next 30 minutes. We're going to have two perspectives today. One at the global level from an international financial institution, and another one from a private company that has some global operations. I'm going to start by introducing Neha Mukhi and ask her to connect her camera and microphone. She's a specialist on energy and climate change at the World Bank, and her work focuses on sustainable energy solutions and enabling climate resilient and low carbon investments in South Asia and Latin America. Neha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to Honorable Prime Minister for her very insightful and inspiring remarks on and call to action. In my presentation today, in our discussion today, I will be focusing on long-term strategies for inclusive growth and sustainable development, which is also the topic of the report that was recently launched, the World Bank Outlook 2050, that lays out how we can support countries on long-term strategies for decarbonization and development to meet the decarbonization and development goals. Now, when we started this work a year ago, we were in a very different time compared to where we are right now. But the current crisis has created an even more pressing need for us to align our immediate priorities and long-term goals of growth and development. We know that sustainable development and climate change are very interlinked. As we heard, climate change poses risk to macroeconomic growth, to stability, financial stability, and overall development outcomes. The current pace and scale of climate action, as we know globally, is not sufficient to meet the goals that we had set out to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The NDCs collectively, as we know, are not ambitious enough to meet this goal. In fact, the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, in the current context, has created an even more challenging situation for us, having to balance these immediate priorities with long-term goals. So it makes it's very important, and it calls on us to think through much harder why long-term strategies for decarbonization and development are important. Firstly, these need to be interlinked and through together in a systematic, integrated way, so as they are not diverging. So these strategies help align our short and medium-term and long-term priorities. These strategies help boost economic growth and create jobs for the future. In fact, they can help address systemic risks to our economy by avoiding the risks of stranded assets, by helping assure policy coherence and enabling investments in resilient development. And having these coherent, solid strategies helps to send out clear market signals to attract private sector investments, to boost private sector investments, and that also help to maximize the use of domestic resources for a country. Now, putting these strategies together requires enhancing cooperation across all stakeholders in the society, across ministries, between government and civil society, and among trading partners, which is equally important in the implementation of these strategies. Now, as you'd highlighted, there has been global progress on achieving action towards meeting climate goals. Investments in renewable energy have been increasing, as we heard, but the challenge of climate change still continues. There is more that needs to be done, and the scale and pace of action is not enough. So why is that the case? One of the main reasons is that climate change so far has been considered as an incremental risk across sectors, as opposed to a systemic risk to the economy that impacts every component, every sector of the economy. Secondly, there are huge financing needs associated with meeting these decarbonization and climate goals. Already, the amount of financing needed to meet our SDGs is significantly high. And if we add on top of that the amount of financing needed to meet our Paris Agreement goals, it's quite high. But we also know that the public financing that is available is very limited, in addition to the MDBs, the development financing. So majority of the financing will need to be coming from private sector. But the governments and public institutions and financial institutions have a very strong role to play in helping to unlock these private sector financing. And those important considerations got us to think about and kickstart the work on World Bank Outlook 2050. Looking at the overall evidence, one thing that became very clear was that while climate change poses systemic risk to the economy, like we heard from the Honorable Prime Minister, risk of physical impacts to infrastructure and assets, risk of assets getting stranded, and overall impacts on poverty levels, on livelihoods, labor productivity, and quality of life. But investing in decarbonization and climate action has huge values and opportunities for return, including enhanced opportunities for investment in emerging markets with very high earning potential associated with that. So as we move forward, as we had highlighted in the thing that became very clear in one of the work, the key recommendations that came up was that transformative climate action that boosts economic growth and helps us meet climate goals requires actions at all levels of the economy, especially a two-level approach, bottom-up, which is cross-cutting across sectors, looking at energy systems, food systems, mobility, urban systems, digital systems, etc., which will need to be complemented by integrating long-term climate objectives across economy-wide actions through a top-down approach, looking at macroeconomic frameworks, national budgets and expenditure frameworks, financial sector regulations and incentives, and adopting a systems approach to planning for economy-wide growth. Now, looking at this a little bit deeper, what do these cross-cutting actions look like? I don't want you to be distracted by this, by the details on this slide, but the main message that came out was the transformative actions for climate action were identified. Majority of these actions across systems tend to be cross-sectoral in nature, which is denoted by the white boxes on the screen, with very few being very sector-specific. So this, further reinforces the point that I'd made earlier, that climate action requires cooperation across ministries, across all stakeholders of the economy to come together for successful design of strategies and implementation to attract investment. Additionally, one more thing that became clear, that these decarbonization actions, many of them can also have adaptation co-benefits when designed and implemented properly. So it's important to think these through in an integrated fashion, looking at systems across sectors as opposed to individual sectors, looking at a comprehensive approach of mitigation and adaptation, tying in to economic growth goals and sustainable development. Now that we've discussed several of these actions, one of the main priorities is how do we operationalize, how do we implement these priorities? Now, from the World Bank's perspective, how these are being looked at is, one, to deepen and strengthen global partnerships for implementation of priorities that work for individual countries and across regions, through development of tailored action plans, developing framework tools and approaches that promote the thinking and planning, or to using systems approach, strategic use of concessional finance, scarce resources of concessional finance that can be used to attract private sector investments through de-risking, through creating enabling policy frameworks, creating incentives for internally and externally for climate action that is aligned with economic growth. And last but not the least, something that is very pertinent in the current context, and we heard from the Honorable Prime Minister, crisis response needs to be very well thought through. Integrating long-term strategies into crisis response and recovery is absolutely essential to ensure that our actions, our immediate actions and investments do not diverge from our long-term growth goals. And this will help avoid having to course correct in the future and help us focus our investments towards sustainable growth, green recovery, and help keep us on the track towards meeting our long-term priorities. Now, with that, I would like to wrap it up and summarize by saying it's very important for us to think through that large amounts of financing and funding is being channeled towards to stimulate economic activity across economies for recovery from the current crisis. Well, this can even be thought through as almost the largest amount of capital allocation or reallocation that would take place in our current lifetimes in many cases. So these would need to be, it is very important that these are aligned with the sustainable growth, the long-term growth perspectives, and our goals of climate action to help avoid having to make future larger investments to course correct in case we are diverging in our current investment priorities. With that, I will wrap it up and turn it over to our moderator, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Neha. So we're going to move to a different perspective, our private sector perspective.
Energy is a universal need, a commodity that is essential to our lives. It powers our societies and shapes the world around us. Energy feeds us, keeps us healthy, and raises our standards of living, while also helping us to learn, communicate, and get from place to place. And what about tomorrow?
I dream of a city where people can breathe.
The future of our planet should concern us all.
What kind of world will we leave behind us?
What good is progress if it doesn't help to fight climate change?
Faced with this emergency, it is our duty to build a different future, together. Our role is to come up with an energy model that preserves our planet. Our purpose is to build a world in which it will be possible to generate carbon-neutral electricity, thanks to nuclear power and renewables. We aim to continuously innovate so that our society can keep on growing. Since our creation, it is our responsibility to make energy available to everyone, at any time and in any circumstances, and to develop new consumer practices by consuming less and by consuming better. It is up to us women and men working for EDF, proud of our public service missions, to change the future. Together, that is our raison d'être. Build a net zero energy future with electricity and innovative solutions and services to help save the planet and drive well-being and economic development.
In the meantime, maybe I'll put a question to Neha, and I'll remind that our participants can use the Q&A feature to ask questions to our panelists. I'm going to start with the point maybe that you raised, Neha, about NDCs, nationally determined contributions, not being of sufficient ambition to meet the climate goals that we need to achieve. I think that was a particularly interesting point, especially given the call to action from the Prime Minister of Barbados and the highlight that current goals and targets are probably insufficient as well to preserve the kinds of standard of living and lifestyles that a very large proportion of the world need to maintain. Any thoughts on sort of the global system and the different role that different actors can have in supporting those nationally determined contributions, maybe particularly with your experience from the World Bank and her financing, and maybe anything that you're doing to help countries maybe increase the ambition and find ways to innovatively finance that?
Thank you, Lauren, for that question. Indeed, as we know that countries are now working towards for their second round, for their update to their NDCs, and several of the countries have put forward their more ambitious nationally determined contributions. In particular, the World Bank has been working with several countries, partnering with our client countries in different regions, including in the Caribbean, to support the analytical work and assessment and to help countries develop these strengthened NDCs. And this has been a very sort of collaborative exercise, working together with our client country partners through a more comprehensive consultative process, and making funding, grant funding typically available for the development of these strategies. And there are also financing mechanisms that have been in place and designed to support the implementation of these NDCs. In fact, the World Bank, prides itself in the climate goals that have been developed, and it's working hard towards meeting, which includes supporting countries in financing and implementation of priorities identified in their NDCs. And a range of climate funding is available, which in many cases has been channeled through the World Bank, including the climate investment funds, particularly, and then also the NDC support facility that is supporting these efforts through the NDC global partnership.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Salmia about the importance and priority that the COVID crisis has gotten, the amount of attention and coverage, and linking that to sort of the economic detrimental effect of it, the environmental crises and other illnesses, interlinkages between sort of all of these issues. Neha, if you have any thoughts on that? I know we, for one, the SDSN, are doing a lot of work right now with the Lancet, the medical journal from the UK, on the COVID-19 crisis. And one of the things that we're definitely looking at is the relationship between deforestation and the loss of natural habitat and the movement of more and more people into these areas that were previously natural habitat, and the greater contact between livestock and humans and pathogens that were hiding out in reservoirs in these areas. I don't know too, I know there are a lot of linkages. That's more on the environmental side. On the economic side, Neha, if you want to share any thoughts about the pandemic and the economic collapse, and the thoughts on building back better, and additional thoughts on how we can leverage these recovery packages for better green growth.
Indeed. So absolutely, as you highlighted, Lauren, biodiversity and linkages to climate change are very strongly being discussed, and there are links with approaches to biodiversity conservation and how they have impacts on climate action as well, and the synergies there. So that certainly is the case. In addition to that, on the economic activity side, we're seeing because of the pandemic, economies are certainly facing a slowdown, and across all sectors, in fact, and some economies, especially small economies that are already vulnerable to other shocks, have faced a compounded shock because of the pandemic. And in terms of the current crisis, while it is important to note the impact, the detrimental impact, both on human lives and economies, it is also important to consider, how to use this situation as potentially an opportunity to finance several of the initiatives that have been on table that can be supportive of both economic growth and climate action. One thing to highlight is we know one of the reasons, one of the points that I've highlighted in my presentation, that climate action in many cases has suffered because of the large amounts of financing needs associated with these investments. And now is the time when huge financing amounts are going to be channeled towards economic growth for economic recovery. If these do not integrate goals of climate action, our development goals, that will be a hugely missed opportunity, and it will again put us on a track that is diverging from our goals of climate action and development, and therefore to avoid that future course correction, which will require furthermore larger amounts of investments, which is already a challenge in the current context of scarce domestic resources, public financing, international financing, and creating systems to attract private sector finance. So I would say that given the huge amounts of capital allocation that will happen in the near term for medium-term recovery from the crisis, it creates a window for aligning these with the long-term goals of climate and development. Some in fact even call it as a once in a lifetime, once in a generation opportunity to make these changes happen.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put what might be one last, maybe we'll have time for one more question to Neha. This one is about broader cooperation between countries. Angela Viano is asking again that cooperation up until this point has been a little bit weak. Again, in many countries, we've seen this trend towards more nationalism and looking inward. She's wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can better support cooperation in the international system.
I think that's a very important point, and both climate challenge and the current pandemic have highlighted how interconnected our systems are across countries, across regions. They impact not just the economic activity, but overall movement of people and opportunities that people are able to access for different for different sort of social and economic well-being. So all in all, it's become very evident that we live in a very interconnected world, and in many cases in our work, what we are seeing is regional engagement and cooperation has highlighted solutions that are more robust, more ambitious, and actually can cost less to individual economies. So it is really important to learn from some of these lessons, some of these evidence that is emerging. Particularly, we're seeing this in case of, say, regional power systems in some cases in Africa, where building on cleaner power systems in neighboring countries can help countries achieve their own clean energy transition goals in a more cost-effective way, and also improve access to electricity for their own economies.
Great, excellent. And in my 2 cents as well, I would add that I very much agree with your point that I think one of the telling things about the pandemic is it has revealed how interconnected we are, how rapidly something that's a contagion or a germ in one place can be spread dramatically around the world, and how we really won't have a solution until we have a global solution. From my perspective, I think one of the challenges we're also facing, which is a little bit unrelated to the climate question, well, I shouldn't say that. I think one of the challenges that we see that's both related to the climate question and the COVID question is sort of this access to technology and intellectual property, whether it's vaccines or renewable energy investments. And again, just the inequalities in our global system there as well, where you see low and middle income countries often struggling for these things, and the wealthier countries having greater access, greater financial resources, greater ability to take advantage. So I know that's something else, that's another gap that the World Bank is hoping to help close, and we're grateful for that. We just have a couple more minutes, and it looks like we've still been unable to connect Béatrice, so that is very unfortunate, but I'm going to put one final question to you, Neha. Do you have any good examples of projects that are well-coordinated cross-sector climate action projects that the World Bank is possibly supporting?
I think a couple of examples maybe that I can share are with respect to integrated resource planning across power systems, for example, in countries that look at the range of resources, looking at the power sector, the water systems, and the urban environments to see how to support, how to look at the various resources in an integrated way, accounting for climate goals of decarbonization and also vulnerability of these systems to climate impacts in a comprehensive approach, while increasing the electricity access in systems. So some of this work has been done in Bangladesh. We're also, launching some of this work in our client countries in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Caribbean islands. Another example that is particularly relevant to the current context is bank financing that has helped electrification of health centers in several of our client countries using innovative solutions of off-grid solar that not only help power critical infrastructure, but also support the off-grid industry that may be suffering due to lower investments in the current environment. Additionally, one sector that often is highlighted as the sector that is still continuing to benefit from investments is the digital sector, where within the current context, as we've moved to more virtual environments to maintain business continuity, countries are accelerating their digital transformation, which has been helpful in enhancing efficiencies in overall process. And there's no doubt that digital solutions actually also enable and contribute to low carbon solutions and climate action across all sectors. Digital can be an enabler of enhanced efficiency, but an underlying point that that is emerging, and we're trying to integrate that in all our engagements, is the growing carbon footprint of digital infrastructure. So it's very important that as these investments are being accelerated, digital infrastructure should be developed and designed as green infrastructure, climate-friendly infrastructure, to continue to unleash the power that these solutions have to enable efficient and more climate-friendly operations across different sectors in the economy.
That, I think, is an excellent point, and I fully agree about the great potential of digital when done well to solve a lot of our climate goals. The other big challenge I would just highlight is our current inequity in access to digital technology being another priority under the SDGs and for the next decade, both for the COVID-19 response, but also for the climate and the energy transition. We are at the end of the hour. We are out of time. Again, I would like to apologize that we couldn't get our speaker Béatrice connected, but I think we'll probably try to record maybe a short interview with her and post it on the website after for anybody who wanted to learn more about the wonderful and innovative things that EDF is doing. It was wonderful to have Neha on the line to hear about the projects of the World Bank. And I offer my sincere thanks one more time to Prime Minister Mottley of Barbados for being with us today as our keynote speaker. It was wonderful to hear her call to action, and I hope that inspires all of us to go out and do what we can to support the energy transition and support small island developing states and middle income island states. With that, I dismiss everybody to our next parallel session, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.